The Chronicles of Prydain by Lloyd Alexander. Book 4, Taran Wanderer. Chapter 20, The Spoilers. Next morning, as Taran had promised, he loaded Melendez and Gurgi's pony with the potter's ware, and, Gurgi beside him, set out for Comet Issav. Anla, he knew, could as well have sent word to the Comet folk asking them to come and bear away their own vessels. "This is not an errand I do for him, but a kindness he does for me," Taran told Gurgi. "I think he means to give me time to myself, to find my own thoughts. As for that," he added sorrowfully, "so far I've found none. I long to stay in Marin, yet there's little to keep me here. I prize Anla as my friend and as a master of his craft, but his craft will never be mine." Still pondering and troubled at heart, Taran reached Issav some while before dusk. It was the smallest comet of all he had seen, with fewer than half a dozen cottages and a little grazing plot for a handful of sheep and cattle. A knot of men were gathered by the sheepfold. As Taran rode closer, he saw their faces tightly drawn and grim. Perplexed at this, he called out his name and told them he brought pottery from Anla Clayshaper. "Greetings to you," said one man, naming himself as Drudwas, son of Pibir. "And farewell in the same breath," he added. "Our thanks to Anla and yourself, but stay to share our hospitality, and you may stay to shed your blood." "Outlaws rove the hills," Dudras went on quickly, answering Taran's questioning frown. "A band, perhaps a dozen strong. We have heard they plundered 2 comets already, and not content were they with a sheep or a cow for their own food, but slaughtered all the herd for the joy of it. Today, not long past, I saw horsemen over the rise, and leading them a yellow-haired ruffian with a sorrel mare." "Dorith!" Taran cried. "How then?" asked one of the comet men. "Do you know this band?" "If it's Dorith's company, I know them well enough," Taran answered. "They are paid swords, and if none will hire them, I judge them glad to kill even without fee. Hard warriors they are, as I have seen them, and cruel as the huntsman of a Nuvan." Drudras nodded gravely. "So it is said. It may be they will pass us by," he went on, "but this I doubt. Comet Issav is small prey, but where defenders are few, the reasons to attack are all the more." Taran glanced at the men. From their faces and bearing, he knew their courage would not lack. But once more he heard Dorith's laughter and recalled the man's cunning and ruthlessness. "And if they attack," he asked, "what shall you do?" "What would you have us do?" Drudwas angrily burst out. "Offer tribute and beg them to spare us? Give our animals to their swords and our homes to their torches? Comet Issav has ever been at peace. Our pride is husbandry, not warfare. But we mean to stand against them. Have we better choice?" "I can ride back to Marin," Taran replied, "and bring you help." "Too far and too long," Drudwas answered. "Nor would I do so even then, for it would leave Marin ill-defended. No, we stand as we are, against 12-7. My son Lassar," he began, indicating a tall, eager-faced boy scarcely older than Taran had been when Call first dubbed him assistant pigkeeper. "Your count is amiss," Taran interrupted. "You are not 7, but 9. Gurgi and I stand with you." Drudwas shook his head. "You owe us no service or duty, wanderer. We welcome your swords, but will not ask for them." "They are yours nonetheless," Taran replied, and Gurgi nodded agreement. "Will you heed me? 9 may stand against a dozen and win the day. But with Dorith, number counts less than skill. Were he alone, I would still fear him as much as 12. He will fight shrewdly and strive to gain the most at least cost. We must answer him in kind." The comet men listened carefully as Taran then spoke of a ruse to make the raiders believe themselves outnumbered and to attack where Dorith would expect no more than feeble defense. "If 2 men were to lie waiting in the sheepfold and 2 in the cattle pen ready to spring up," Taran said, "they might take the band unawares and hold them a few moments while the rest of us attack from ambush in the rear. At the same time, if the women of your household set up a din with rakes and hoes, it would seem other swordsmen had hastened to join us." Drudwas thought a long moment, then nodded. Your plan may be sound, Wanderer, but I fear for those in the pens, as they must bear the brunt for all of us. If aught should go awry, small chance of escape would they have. I shall be one to keep watch in the sheepfold, Taran began. And I the other, Lusar broke in quickly. Drudwas frowned. I would not spare you because you are my son. You're a good lad and gentle with the flock. I think of your years. The flock is in my charge, Lusar cried. By right, my place is with the Wanderer. The men spoke hurriedly among themselves, at last agreeing that Lusar would keep watch with Taran, while Drudwas stood guard over the cattle along with Gurgi, who, fearful though he was, refused to be any farther from Taran's side. By the time all plans were set and the comet men posted among the trees just beyond the sheepfold, a full moon had risen above thin clouds. The cold light sharpened the edges of the shadows and the outlines of brush and branches. In the fold, Taran and Lusar crouched amid the restless flock. For a time, neither spoke. In the bright moonlight, the face of Lusar seemed to Taran more boyish than before. He saw the youth was afraid and making all effort to hide it. Though uneasy himself, he grinned assuredly at Lusar. Drudwas had been right. The boy was young, untried, and yet Taran smiled, knowing that he himself, at Lusar's age, would have claimed the same right. Your plan is good, Wanderer, Lusar said at last in a hushed voice, speaking, Taran knew, more to ease his own disquiet than anything else. Better than we should have done. It cannot fail. All plans can fail, Taran said almost harshly. He fell silent then. Fears had begun stirring in him like leaves in a chill wind. Sweat drenched his body under the fleece jacket. He had come to Issav unknown, unproven, yet the men of the comet had willingly heeded him and willingly put their fate in his hands. They had accepted his plan when another might have served better. Should it fail, though all their lives could be forfeit, the blame would be his alone. He gripped the hilt of his sword and strained his eyes to peer into the darkness. There was no movement, and even the shadows seemed frozen. You are called Wanderer, Lusar went on quietly with some shyness. To my mind, one who wanders must as well be one who seeks. Is this true? Taran shook his head. I sought once to be a smith and once to be a weaver, and once a potter. But that is over. Now perhaps I must wander without seeking. If you seek nothing, Lusar said with a friendly laugh, then you have little chance of finding it. Our life is not easy here, he went on. It's not willingness that lacks, but knowledge. The sons of Dawn have long held Prydain against the Lord of Anuvin, and therefore for their protection we are grateful. Yet the secrets our and Deathlord stole from us. To regain them, my father says, would give a stouter shield and sword than even the battle hosts of Prince Gwydion himself. But for all that, Issav is my home, and I am well content with it. Lusar grinned. I do not envy you, Wanderer. Taran did not answer for a time. Then he murmured, No, it is I who envy you. They said no more, listening alertly to every sound as the night wore away and the moon, fading behind thickening clouds, lost shape and its light spread like pale mist. In a while, Lusar blew out his breath in relief. They will not come, he said. They will pass us by. Even as he spoke, the darkness shattered in fragments that turned into the figures of armed warriors. Taran sprang to his feet as the gate burst open. Taran sounded his battle horn, then flung himself upon the warrior, who cried out in surprise and stumbled backward. Lusar had leaped up at the same instant as Taran, and the shepherd plunged against the press of the attackers at the gate, thrusting with his spear. Taran struck out blindly, struggling not only against the raiders, but against the sudden terror that his plan had failed, that the outlaws had come too silently, too swiftly. In another moment, above the frantic bleating of the frightened animals, a great shout burst from the comet men as they rose from the cover of the trees, and from the huts came the clash of iron upon iron. At the sheepfold, the outlaws hesitated. Lusar's opponent had fallen. Taran glimpsed the boy spring past him and strike again with his spear. The attack wavered at the gate as the raiders turned their weapons against the men of Issav. But one warrior, growling like a wild beast, long knife upraised, raced into the pen as if to wreak all the destruction he could, and Taran grappled with the man who spun about and slashed at him. It was Gloff. The warrior recognized him. Gloff's first astonishment changed to an ugly grin, almost of pleasure and eagerness, as he shifted the knife in his hand. Gloff lunged, and Taran flung up his weapon to ward against the blow. But the warrior leaped forward, his free hand clawing at Taran's eyes, and his blade flickered as its point drove swiftly in a killing stroke. A figure plunged between them. It was Lassar. Taran shouted a warning as the boy strove to catch the blow on his spear shaft. Snarling, Gloff turned his attack and struck viciously at Lassar. The shepherd fell. With a cry of rage, Taran raised his sword. Suddenly, Drudwas was beside him. Gloff shrieked as the blade of the husbandman chopped downward. Under the onslaught of the comet folk, Dorith's warriors fell back. Amid the turmoil of racing men, Taran found himself borne away from the fold. Daring a backward glance, he could glimpse neither Drudwas nor Lassar. In fury, he pressed onward. Torches flared, and he saw that the women and girls of Issav had joined their men, flailing with hoes, rakes, and pitchforks at the raiders. Taran cast about for Gurgi and shouted his name, but his voice was drowned in the tumult. A fierce bellowing had risen from the cattle pen as a dark shape burst through the bars. Taran gasped in astonishment to see a furious black bull heaving and plunging among the raiders. On its back clung Gurgi, yelling at the top of his voice, kicking his heels against the powerful animal's flanks, turning its charge against the terrified remainder of Dorith's band. "They flee!" shouted one of the comet men. Taran pressed ahead. The raiders, who had left their mounts at the fringe of trees, now hastened to gain them, caught between the comet folk and the slashing horns of the enraged bull. Taran glimpsed Dorith astride the sorrel mare and ran to overtake him, but Dorith spurred the steed and galloped into the wood. Taran turned and raced to the stables, whistling for Melendless. One of the comet men caught at his arm and cried, "The day is ours, wanderer!" Only then did Taran realize the sounds of the fray had ceased. Dorith himself had vanished. Taran hurried to the sheepfold where the wife of Drudwas knelt, her arms about her son. "Lassar!" Taran cried in dismay, dropping beside the shepherd. The boy's eyes opened, and he strove to grin at Taran. "His wound is not deep," said Drudwas. "He will live to tend his flock." "And so I will," Lassar said to Taran. "And thanks to you, I'll have a flock to tend." Taran put a hand on the boy's shoulder. "And thanks to you," he answered. "To you I owe much more than sheep." "Full half the band will plunder no longer," said Drudwas. "Neither Comet Issav nor any comet. The rest are scattered, and it will be long before their wounds heal. You have well served us, wanderer, you and your companion. You came among us strangers. We count you strangers no longer, but friends." The Chronicles of Prydain by Lloyd Alexander. Book 4. Taran Wanderer. The final chapter. Chapter 21. The Mere. Although the folk of Issav urged him to linger, Taran took leave of them and rode slowly back to Marin. The defeat of Dorith's company held no savor, for his thoughts still turned restlessly. His questions still found no answers. He was more downhearted than ever. To Anlaw, he said little of his deeds in Issav, and it was Gurgi, bursting with pride, who told what had befallen them.
"Yes, yes!" cried Gurgi. "Wicked robbers fled with yellings. Oh, they feared kindly master, and feared bold Gurgi too. And great bull with stompings and trampings, sharp horns with jabbings and stabbings."
"You should be well content, wanderer," Anlaw said to Taran, who had remained silent all the while. "You've saved honest folk their lives and homes." "Drudwas told me I was no stranger, but a friend. For that I am glad," Taran answered. "I only wish," he added, "that I weren't a stranger to myself." "What use am I?" he burst out. "To myself, to anyone? None that I can see." "The folk of Issav might gainsay you," the potter answered. and there might be others who would welcome a stout blade and a bold heart. A hired sword, Taran replied bitterly, and follow the same path as Dorith? He shook his head. When I was a child, I dreamed of adventure, glory, of honor, and feats of arms. I think now that these things are shadows. If you see them as shadows, then you see them for what they are, Anlaw agreed. Many have pursued honor, and in the pursuit lost more of it than ever they could gain. But I did not mean a hired sword. He stopped abruptly and was thoughtful a moment. To see them for what they are, he murmured, returning to his first words. Perhaps. The potter looked closely at Taran. The comet lore tells how one may see himself for what he is. Whether it be true or not, or more wives' tales, I will not judge, the potter went on slowly. But the lore says that he who would know himself need only gaze in the mirror of Lunette. Though Anlaw had spoken quietly, Taran heard the potter's words like a thunderclap. The mirror of Lunette? Taran cried. Since leaving Craddock's Valley, he had put away all thought of the mirror, hidden and forgotten it, and the days had covered it as dead leaves on a burial mound. The mirror, he repeated in a stifled voice. The goal of my quest from the beginning. I had given up searching. Now do I find it when I seek it least of all? Your quest? Anlaw said, perplexed. He had risen and was watching Taran with concern. Of this you told me nothing, wanderer. I would have no pride in the telling, Taran replied. But now, as Anlaw listened quietly, a look of kindness on his face, little by little, Taran was able to speak of Caer Dallben, of Ordu, of where the quest had led him, of Craddock's death and his own despair. Once, Taran concluded, I would have asked nothing better than to find the mirror. Now, even if it were in my hand, I would dread to look in it. I understand your fears, the potter answered quietly. The mirror may put your heart at ease, or trouble you all the more. Such is the risk. The choice must be yours. But know this, wanderer, Anlaw went on, as Taran bit his lips in silence. It is not such a mirror as you think. It lies close by here in the Lagradorn Mountains, no more than 2 days' distance, in a cave at the head of the Lake of Lunette. The mirror of Lunette is a pool of water. A pool of water? Taran cried. What enchantment gives it power? For enchanted it must be. It is, answered the potter, to those who deem it so. What of yourself? Taran asked in a low voice. Have you sought to look in it? That I have not, replied Anlaw, for I well know who I am, Anlaw Clayshaper. For better or worse, that knowledge must serve me my lifetime. And I, Taran murmured, what knowledge will serve mine? He said nothing for a time. At last he raised his head. It is true. I fear to look in the mirror, and fear to know what it might tell me. But I have already known shame, he flung out bitterly. Must I know cowardice as well? In the morning, Taran continued, in the morning I journeyed to the mirror of Lunette. His decision gave him little comfort. At first light, as he and Gurgi saddled their mounts, his doubts chilled him more than the cold mist of late autumn. Nevertheless, having made his choice, he set a swift pace, riding northward from Meran to the Lagradorn Mountains, taking his bearings on the high peak of Mount Meladin, for it was at the foot of Meladin, as Anlaw told him, that he would find the cave. The companions rode silently and steadily, halting only when the day had so far waned they could no longer guide the steeds along the paths. They camped on the soft carpet of pine needles, but a deep uneasiness had settled on the two wayfarers, and they slept little. At dawn of the next day, they gathered up their gear and rode at a good pace along the crest of a ridge. Soon, Taran called out and pointed downward. The lake of Lunette stretched in a long oval, gleaming in the early sun. Its waters were calm, blue, and the lake itself seemed a perfect mirror that held the tree-lined shore in its depths. At some distance, Mount Meladin rose, tall but seeming almost weightless in the mist, still clinging to its long slopes. Taran's heart beat faster as the companions made their way downward to the shore. Closer to Meladin, the land fell in sharp drops, and short stretches of meadow broke into shallow ravines. Near a stream tumbling from the upper reaches of the mountain, the companions tethered their steeds. Taran had already sighted the cave and hastened toward it, with Gurgi scrambling after him. "There!" Taran cried. "There! The mere!" At the foot of Meladin, wind and weather had carved an arcing cave, little more than a few paces deep. Rivulets trickled from the moss-grown rocks of its overhanging brow. Taran raced toward it. His heart pounded, his pulse burnt in his wrists. Yet as he drew closer, his pace slowed, and fear weighed heavy as a chain about his legs. At the mouth of the cave, he halted a long moment. Gurgi glanced anxiously at him. "It is here," Taran murmured. He stepped forward. Within, a shallow basin hollowed in the floor of smooth stones, lay the mirror of Lunette, like a shield of polished silver, gleaming of itself despite the shadows. Taran slowly knelt at the rim. The basin held no more than a finger's depth of water, fed drop by drop from a thread of moisture twining down the rocky wall. The passing of countless years had not filled it to the brim. Yet, shallow though it was, the water seemed a depthless crystal whose faucets turned one upon the other, each catching brilliant beams of white. Scarcely daring to breathe lest he trouble the shining surface, Taran bent closer. The cave was utterly silent, and it seemed that even the falling of a wisp of dry moss would shatter the reflection. His hands trembled as he saw his own face, travel-worn and sun-scorched. With all his heart, he longed to turn away, but forced himself to look more deeply. Were his eyes playing tricks on him? Closer he knelt. What he saw made him cry out in disbelief. At the same instant, Gurgi shrieked in terror. Taran leaped to his feet and spun around as Gurgi ran and cowered at his side. Before him stood Dorith. The man's face was stubble-bearded. His dirty yellow hair hung into his eyes. The horsehide jacket was slashed along one side, and mud crusted his boots. In one hand he held food, which he scooped up with his fingers and crammed into his mouth. He grinned at Taran.
"Well met, Lord Swineherd,"
Dorith said between mouthfuls.
"Ill met, Dorith,"
Taran cried, drawing his sword.
"Will you call your company to set upon us? Call them then, all who fled us at Comet Issav."
He raised the weapon and strode forward. Dorith lashed harshly.
"Will you strike before my own blade is out?"
"Draw then," Taran flung back at him.
"So I shall, when my meal is done,"
Dorith said. He gave a scornful grunt.
"Your blade is ill-favored, swineherd. Uglier than Gloff's face."
He grinned slyly.
"Mine is the fairer weapon, yet gained at no cost. My company," he added. "Would you have me call them? They are deaf. For half of them, the dirt of their graves stopped their ears. I saw you at Issav, and guessed it was you who rallied the comet clods. Alas, I had no time to linger and pay my greetings to you."
Dorith wiped his mouth on the back of his hand.
"Of those who rode from Issav, 2 cowards fled, and I've seen none of them. 2 were heavily wounded. Those I myself sped on their journey to the carrion crows, and they burden me no longer. But no matter, I'll soon find others to join me. Meantime, so much the better," he went on. "I'll share your treasure with none but myself."
"Treasure?" Taran cried. "There is no treasure. Draw your blade, Dorith, or I'll kill you unarmed, as you'd have done me."
"An end to your lying, swineherd,"
Dorith growled.
"Do you still take me for a fool? I've known of your travels, and the bent path you followed here did not deceive me. Your saddlebags hold nothing of worth. I've seen that for myself. So the prize is yet to be claimed."
He strode to the mirror.
"Is this your trove? What have you found, swineherd? A mud puddle? What does it hide?"
Taran cried out, though before he could fling himself upon Dorith, the warrior stamped his heavy boot into the pool and, with a curse sent the water spurting from the basin. "It holds nothing!" Dorith burst out, his face twisting in rage. Taran gasped and stumbled forward. Dorith drew his sword. "My meal is ended, swineherd!" Dorith cried. He struck heavily, and the force of his onslaught sent Taran reeling from the cave. Gurgi yelled in fury and clutched at the warrior, who seized him with a powerful grasp and dashed him against the rocky wall. Snarling, Dorith sprang after Taran. Scrambling to his feet, Taran brought up his blade to meet the warrior's attack. Dorith spat and lunged again, driving Taran toward the slope. As the warrior bore closer upon him, Taran lost his footing, stumbled backward, and dropped to one knee. With a mocking laugh, Dorith raised his weapon, and Taran saw the blade that once had been his own glint sharply as Dorith swung it down with all his strength. Taran saw his death upon him and flung up his sword in a last attempt to ward against the blow. The blades met with a grating, ringing clash. Taran's weapon shuddered in his hand. The shock threw him to earth, yet his blade held. The sword of Dorith shattered on it. Cursing, Dorith flung the useless hilt at Taran's face, turned and ran to the cover of pines along the shore. Hearing her master's whistle, Dorith's sorrel mare broke from the trees. Taran sprang to pursue the fleeing warrior.
"Help! Help!"
Gurgi's voice cried from the cave.
"Kindly master, help wounded Gurgi!"
Hearing this, Taran halted even as Dorith leaped astride his mount and galloped away. Taran raced to the cave. Within, Gurgi moaned and tried to sit up. Taran knelt quickly and saw the creature's forehead was heavily gashed, but that Gurgi's pain came more from terror than from his hurts. He carried him from the cave and propped him against a boulder. Taran did not return to the Mere of Lunette. Already he had seen it empty. Its spattered water spread over the stones, holding only the muddy print of Dorith's boot. He sank down beside Gurgi and put his head in his hands. For long he did not move or speak. "Come," he said at last, helping Gurgi to his feet. "Come, we have far to journey." A light glowed in Anlaw's hut. The night was nearly spent, yet Taran saw the potter still bent over his wheel. Anlaw rose to his feet as Taran slowly crossed the threshold. Neither spoke for some while. The potter anxiously studied Taran's face and said at last, "Have you looked into the mere, wanderer?" Taran nodded. "For a few moments, but none shall look in it again. It is destroyed." He told of Dorith and the happenings at the Lake of Lunette. When Taran had done, the potter sadly shook his head. "You saw nothing then?" said Anlaw. "I learned what I sought to learn," Taran replied. "I will not question you, wanderer," said Anlaw. "But if it is in your heart to tell me, I will listen." I saw myself," Taran answered. "In the time I watched, I saw strength and frailty, pride and vanity, courage and fear, of wisdom, a little, of folly, much, of intentions, many good ones, but many more left undone. In this, alas, I saw myself a man like any other. But this too I saw," he went on. "Alike as men may seem, each as different as flakes of snow, no two the same. You told me you had no need to seek the mere, knowing you were Anlaw Clayshaper. Now I know who I am, myself and none other. I am Taran." Anlaw did not reply immediately. Then he said, "If you have learned this, you have learned the deepest secret the mere could tell you. Perhaps it was truly enchanted after all." "There was no enchantment," Taran answered. He smiled. "It was a pool of water, the most beautiful I have seen, but a pool of water, no more than that. At first," he went on, "I thought Ordu had sent a fool on a fool's errand. She did not. She meant me to see what the mere showed me. Any stream, any river would have given me the same reflection, but I would not have understood it then as I understand it now. As for my parentage," he added, It makes little difference. True kinship has naught to do with blood ties, however strong they be. I think we are all kin, brothers and sisters, one to the other, all children of all parents. And the birthright I once sought, I seek it no longer. The folk of the free comets taught me well that manhood is not given, but earned. Even King Smite and Cantref Catifer told me this, but I did not heed him. Leneo said life was a net for luck. To Heaviad the smith, life was a forge, and to Dwyvak the weaver woman, a loom. They spoke truly, for it is all of these. But you, Taran said, his eyes meeting the potter's, you have shown me life is one more thing. It is clay to be shaped, as raw clay on a potter's wheel. Anla nodded. And you, wanderer, how will you shape your clay? I cannot stay in Marin, Taran replied, much as I love it. Caer Dallben waits for me, as it has always waited. My life is there, and gladly I return to it, for I have been too long away. They sat silently then, Taran, Gurgi, and Anla Clayshaper. As dawn lightened, Taran clasped the potter's hand and bade him farewell. Good journey to you, wanderer, called Anla as Taran swung astride Melendez. Do not forget us, for we shall not forget you. I have the sword I fashioned, Taran proudly cried, the cloak I wove, and the bowl I shaped, and the friendship of those in the fairest land of Prydain. No man can find greater treasure. Melendez pawed the ground, impatient, and Taran gave the stallion rein. Thus, Taran rode from Marin with Gurgi at his side. As he did, it seemed he could hear voices calling to him, Remember us! Remember us! He turned once, but Marin was far behind and out of sight. From the hills, a wind had risen, driving the scattered leaves before them, bearing homeward to Caer Dallben. Taran followed it. Thus ends Book 4 of the Chronicles of Prydain, Taran Wanderer. Join us next time for Book 5, The High King.